Hello, hello. So I want to start off by thanking Trinity for the inspiration for today's podcast episode. She asked a question in my broadcast channel the other day saying, I keep hearing that the days of hyper niches are over. Thoughts? And I thought that this would be such a good thing to talk about on the podcast because I think that there is nothing that has ever been less true than this. And it is something that I keep seeing all over Instagram as well. So I wanted to sort of bust this myth that niching is over, right? With so many content creators on Instagram these days, with the rise of I think that there has never been a more important time to have a clear niche. When you have a clear niche, it helps to establish you as an expert. It helps you to stand out online. It makes marketing easier. It creates excitement for the clients that you work with as a clinician. It allows you to really master your craft and become a better therapist. And it opens the doors to so many other business opportunities beyond one on one therapy, like brand deals, partnerships, speaking opportunities. And there is a way to still niche down while not having all of your content be like super pigeonholed where you feel like a robot. Right. And that's what I want to talk about in today's episode of like, how can you niche down in a way where you can still be a whole human with multiple interests? Because I think that that is really, really important. And that's actually how you niche down effectively. And then we're also going to talk about being too hyper niche because while I don't think that that is something that is done often, it is possible to do. And so I want to share some examples of what that looks like too, so you can make sure that you are not making that mistake. So let's get into it. First, I want to talk about why you should consider niching down if you are looking for private pay clients. And then we're going to talk about niching down if your goals focus more on social media. So if you have a goal to get private pay clients, you absolutely need to have a niche, right? I get that it can be scary to have a niche, but because you're like maybe afraid that you're going to turn potential clients away. Maybe you fear that you're not experienced enough to have a specialty. Maybe you're afraid that you're going to get bored or you have other clinical interests. And so you don't want to niche down and exclude people. But the truth is that if you want to build a private pay practice, if you want clients to decide, I'm going to forego my insurance benefits and I'm going to pay top dollar for therapy, they will not do that if they are looking for a general therapist, right? Even if they have out of network benefits are still more expensive and there's still a little bit of a hassle, right? And so the reason why clients decide to do that is because they really want you specifically to be their therapist. And people are not going to have that strong of a desire to work with you if one, you're like speaking blandly and you're just creating content or directory listings or website listings that might relate to them, might relate to their sister, might relate to their uncle, right? Like they need to feel like you are a therapist who's speaking directly to them. And they need to feel like you get them. They need to feel like they like you, right? And that's not going to happen unless you are creating content and showing up well in a niche way, right? You've probably heard me say this a zillion times, but if you are speaking to everybody, you are speaking to nobody, nothing is going to resonate. And niching down is not to like exclude people, right? Or turn them away, but it's really to build that trust with the right people that you are a therapist who is an expert in helping them. And if you don't do this, it's going to take you a lot longer to fill your caseload. It's going to be very, very, very challenging to fill it with private pay clients. You're going to be like pushing a paddle upstream, right? There are thousands and thousands and thousands of general therapists who take insurance. But if you want to build private pay, that is not going to work for you, right? I didn't make $250,000 my first year in private practice by being a generalist. I made it by speaking directly to anxious, overachieving women, by being somebody who they felt like understood their problems because I had similar levels of anxiety and I had gotten through it, because I created content that was relatable to them, because I spoke to their pain points, because I spoke to their desires, and because I showed up as a human who they liked and wanted to spend time with every week, right? Who they wanted to open up to. I'm going to share a few examples of therapists inside of Private Practice Academy who've had a lot of success after niching down, because I know that it can be like such a mental struggle to decide to niche. And for me, hearing from other people who had niched down successfully and who had credited a lot of their success to their ability to niche down really inspired and motivated me to be able to go all in on my niche. So I'm going to read you a few messages here. So, Sit with Allison said, after niching down and speaking directly to parentified daughters from dysfunctional families, my DMs filled with messages like, every single reel feels like it was made for me. Shortly after this, she started hitting consistent $10,000 months with private pay clients. Natasha on Instagram at Clark Family Counseling updated her Psychology Today bio to speak directly to overthinkers and people pleasers. 2 days later, she booked her first consult from Psychology Today, and the client happily said yes to her $250 private pay rate. Regulate with Danielle is a Private Practice Academy alumni, and she niched down to speak specifically to first responders with anxiety. After doing this, she quickly booked an intro call with a client who said yes to her $200 private pay rate, and she secured her first brand deal, right? This is to show you that you can have any niche, right? There's not like a specific niche that is going to be successful. But when you niche down, when your messaging is clear, it is going to help you on social media. It's going to help you get private pay clients. It's going to even help you with things like Psychology Today, right? And it can open up a lot of opportunities. So I want to use Danielle saying that she got her first brand deal as sort of like a transition to our next topic here. When you are niche down, it is going to help you grow your following, and it is going to open up so many more opportunities with stuff like brand deals as well. So what happens when you don't have a niche on social media is it is hard to build a really engaged following and an engaged community. Yes, sometimes you might have a piece of content that goes viral because it speaks to the masses, but those people are probably not going to actually follow you if after they view that reel, they go to your profile and they don't feel like everything else is made directly for them. So it's not going to do a ton for your business. People are not going to feel really engaged because they're not going to feel seen by you. They're not going to feel like, oh my gosh, she relates to everything that I'm thinking and feeling. If you want your content to build a strong, loyal community of people who want to work with you, who trust you, who vibe with you, that is what is going to open up the doors, not just to a full caseload, but to things like brand deals, right? That's how you have influence over people. In order to get brand deals, right? The term influencer is not random. People are influencers because they have influence, right? So if they share a link to their Amazon top, other people trust their judgment, trust their style, and they want to then buy that Amazon top, right? They have influence. And this can, work in a ton of different ways besides clothing. But at the end of the day, people need to like trust your recommendations in order for brands to hire you to create content to sell their products or services. And that happens by building that loyal, strong, tight-knit community. And I want to give you an example from myself of hyper niching. So I have 2 Instagram accounts, Sit with Kelly, which is where I started my therapy practice, and Business of Therapy, where I talk about like my business coaching and offers for therapists. And my Business of Therapy page is very hyper niched, right? I'm not just talking about marketing in general. I'm not just talking about building a business. I'm talking about marketing on Instagram for therapists who want to build a private pay practice. There is a clear outcome there. There is clear desires, right? That is so niche specific. And because of that, yes, maybe I'm losing a lot of people who might be building coaching businesses, or they might be building, merch businesses, or they might be estheticians, or they might be, hairdressers, all people that maybe I have the skills to help because I understand business, I understand marketing, I understand Instagram. But if I tried to speak to all of those people, my message would get so diluted that the therapist who I was most passionate about helping would not feel seen in my content. They would not feel like this page is specifically for me and my exact goals. Of course, I'm going to follow Kelly. Of course, I'm going to go to her for advice, right? And so I think that is like a really helpful way to sort of think about it. Think about the people that you follow when you're looking for things. Like, are they specific to you? Now, I know that most of the therapists who follow me and are in my programs are women. I know they're mostly in the US. I know they're mostly in their 20s to 30s to 40s, right? And I keep that in mind. I know that in the back of my head, and I keep that in mind with the music I choose, with the examples I give, with the pieces of my life I share, with my brand colors. But I don't need to say that because it is not the most important detail for why we are connected. right? So when I'm creating content, I'm not like, POV, you're a therapist in her 30s, who lives in a big city and wants to build a private pay practice with Instagram. That's irrelevant. That's like word mumbo jumbo, right? Instead, I'm able to show like I'm a woman in my 30s, right? Like I can just show that as a connecting piece. I don't need to say that in every single reel. And so I think that is like maybe starting to show you what like hyper niching down too much can look like, is not to say like I'm not trying to target those people. I absolutely am. But if I start calling that out, it just feels almost like inauthentic and just mumbo jumbo to be saying that in every reel. And so instead, I really want you to think about like, who is it that, like, what is the biggest connecting point that you have with people? What is the reason that they are coming to you and wanting to follow you or to work with you, right? And focus on that when you are calling things out, when you are identifying people in your community, when you are making content. Niching is really, really important for brand deals because brands want access to a specific audience, right? And so brands are going to want to collaborate with creators who have a similar target market, who have a similar audience as the people they are trying to sell their product or services to. Now, I've done a lot of collaborations over the years with big brands, with small brands on my Sit with Kelly page, on my Business of Therapy page. I've worked with brands like Dove, Adobe, CVS, Painless Pregnancy, Recovery.com, Yoga Sleep, Ollie Vitamins, Thrizer, Jane, Teachable, Alma, right? I've worked with all kinds of stuff. And some of these brands were very hyper niche specific, right? To like mental health supplements, to Recovery.com, where to find a therapist, to Dove, body image. And some of them were more broad, right? I have worked with many brands over the years on both my Sit with Kelly page, my Business of Therapy page, this podcast even. I've collaborated with big household name brands like Dove, Adobe, CVS, and I've also collaborated with smaller brands that are really focused to my niche, whether that be, mental health, anxiety, motherhood, like, brands like Recovery.com, Yoga Sleep, Ollie, Painless Pregnancy, or brands that are really hyper niche specific and helping therapists in private practice, right? Brands like Thrizer, Jane, Teachable, Alma. And this is what I've learned, right? It is a lot easier to get partnerships with brands that are hyper niche specific and that share that same niche as you, because they are more limited in the like content creators that they can work with, right? So if a brand wants to reach therapists who are building a private practice, there is a limited number of creators that they can choose to work with. Now, if a brand wants to work with, if a brand wants to reach parents, there's tons and tons and tons of creators that they can work with. And so we need to be more niche specific there if you want to get brand deals, especially if you're somebody who doesn't have like a giant audience, right? So maybe we are speaking to anxious parents. Maybe we're speaking to anxious parents of young kiddos. Maybe we're speaking to anxious parents of young kiddos and you have a hyper local, audience. And so we're trying to like communicate more that way. It is really helpful to know who it is that you are speaking to. And I want to share, like in 2025, I brought in over $200,000 of brand deals. And the majority of these actually came from the Business of Therapy side of my social media versus Sit with Kelly. And that's interesting because I have about half the number of followers on Business of Therapy as I do on Sit with Kelly. But Business of Therapy is really hyper niched, right? Hyper niching is not dead. Hyper niching is super, super important. Now, to talk about the Sit with Kelly side of things for a little bit, because I do think. Now, I want to talk about the Sit with Kelly side of things for a little bit because I recognize that that's probably Now, I want to talk about the Sit with Kelly side of things for a little bit because I recognize that that's where most therapists probably connect more and have like a more similar niche. So you are able to change and adapt your niche over time. That is something that I have certainly done since I started my Instagram page in October 2020. So when I started my Instagram page and I really got a handle on what my niche was and what I was doing there, I was really speaking to anxious millennials. That was my like tagline of who I was speaking to. But I knew in the back of my head what flavor of anxiety I was speaking to, right? So I wasn't calling this out all the time, but the examples that I gave for what anxiety looked like was really clear that I was speaking to, people who were overachievers, people who were ambitious, people who were chronic overthinkers, people who had big jobs, right? Lived in a big city. I was creating a lot of content in New York City where I lived at the time. Single and engaged, like kind of that like younger stage of life in their 20s and 30s versus married and with kids. And I shared, beyond that, a lot of other interests of mine, right? I shared content when I traveled. I shared in stories about concerts that I would go to, restaurants I would eat at. I shared about making my coffees. I shared my workouts all the time. I shared political stuff. And that sort of created like a community of people who shared similar values and interests to me, in addition to being anxious millennials, right? And so I wasn't creating content saying, like, POV, you're an anxious millennial who loves working out and cares about liberal politics. But that's who I was creating content for. And it was clear as I was building community, as I made jokes about political anxiety or things putting down Trump or, B-roll of me at a Pilates class, I was building community with other people who shared those similar interests. As I have grown as a person, as I have like changed stages of life, my content has evolved as well, right? So I was pregnant last year. I shared a lot of content around pregnancy and started to sort of like lean more into that space. Since having my son, Aiden, in September, I've definitely sort of like switched gears and now I'm focusing more on anxious moms. And it's been really like seamless, honestly. I think because a lot of the anxious millennial women who I was originally speaking to now have kids, right? They're no longer in that single engaged stage of life. A lot of them have become mothers themselves. And so with that, you know, my page might still look different than other therapists for anxious moms because I'm sharing still the parts of myself that I want to cultivate an online community around, right? So I'm speaking also about being a business owner, about being a therapist, and really speaking to sort of like that overachieving, ambitious type. I share a lot of content about like the oldest daughter stereotype and that flavor of anxiety because that's something I can relate to. It's something I really, really enjoy working with clients on. I've been sharing a lot more lately about being a working mom, right? Again, kind of speaking to that like overachieving, ambitious person. I share a lot about my dog and my baby, right? Interests that I hope to, cultivate and share with others. I've not since traveled since having my son, but I hope to soon. And when I do, I will be sharing content around that because that's a huge piece of who I am, something I really value and enjoy. I share my coffee, my food, my workouts. I share like some couples content with my husband occasionally. I share about politics often because values are important to me. I share about the shows that I'm watching. And that can all build community, right? And it's not, again, we don't have to call it out and say, I'm working with anxious moms who have a big career and still want to find time to travel and work out while being an advocate in their community. But I know that that's who I'm speaking to, right? And so I'm able to know that in the back of my head without like hyper niching to a point where I'm like pigeonholed and people feel like this is just like a random list of character traits. I hope that that makes sense. So let's transition a little bit to talk about how you can go ahead and incorporate these other pieces of you, right? So if your niche is, if So let's talk about ways that you can share other pieces of you, right? I think that stories are a huge one, Instagram stories. This is a very low lift, very casual way for you to share other pieces of your life outside of the therapy room that show your people who you are, that help them to connect, that help them to relate. And it can be mundane things, right? Like iced coffee. A lot of people like iced coffee. That does not make me any more likely to be a good therapist for somebody, to have a good conversation with them, to vibe. But if other people drink iced coffee and I drink iced coffee, that can feel connecting, right? It doesn't need to be an insane self disclosure. It doesn't need to be like a big, interesting detail. But when people see little parts of your day, they feel connected to you and they recognize those similarities that they share. Storytelling is also really helpful. So, and I want to encourage you to try and think about like how you can show versus tell something, right? So maybe you want to work with other creatives with anxiety. We don't need to always say, if you're creative with anxiety and call that out. We can show that you want to work with creatives, right? And we can show that with the examples that we share, right? So maybe you share, a story in a reel about how you felt anxious showing someone your art for the first time, right? That can be a way to showcase the flavor of anxiety or the flavor of person is around like sharing your art, right? That's definitely speaking to creatives, but we're not having to like call it out and shove it down people's throat. We can also show that you're creative with the clothes that you wear, your personal style, right? With the background in videos, right? Maybe you have art on the wall with what you're doing in your B-roll. Maybe you are doing art. There's all kinds of ways that we can show that you work with creatives without having to make that your specific niche. Values are really big these days. I think people really want to know your values now more than ever. And we live in a very divisive political climate. Share them in your stories, share them in your content if that feels okay. You can do like the occasional random post and reel that has nothing to do with your niche, can be a way to connect. Now, let's talk about how you can do this wrong and how you can be too niched, right? So, if I were to say on Sit with Kelly, helping first time moms with anxiety who are also therapists and oldest daughters stop feeling so overwhelmed and let go of perfectionism and heal their anxious attachment so they can finally feel good enough, my brain just like shuts off hearing that, right? It's like, what? And I know like that is actually who I'm speaking to in my content, but I don't want to call everything out, right? And you don't need to say it in every single way. Sometimes we can show it with our words and it takes a little bit more intentionality. I try and set you up for this really well in the Reels membership. But you can demonstrate that without having to label people in every piece of content. So, for example, maybe you want to work with people with anxious attachment. Instead of saying like the girlies with anxious attachment in every reel, you can show it with your content. And I'm going to link this example in the show notes here. But I did a reel that said, when I'm about to ask my husband if he still loves me after we have the slightest disagreement, right? This is a way of demonstrating anxious attachment. In the video, I'm holding my baby, right? That's a way to demonstrate that I'm speaking to moms, to new moms, right? But I don't need to say anxious attachment. I don't need to say girlies. I don't need to say moms because it's clear from the video that I'm speaking to moms, right? That I'm a woman, I'm carrying my baby. And then I'm saying when I'm about to ask my husband if he still loves me after we have the slightest disagreement, someone with an anxious attachment style is going to relate to that. They're going to know that that content is for them. Another example, and I'll link this reel in the show notes as well, is instead of saying like therapist moms in my content, I said my toxic trait is telling people to take care of themselves while I'm running on an average of 4 hours of sleep, enough caffeine to kill a bear, and a bagel. And in this reel, I'm doing B-roll of me pushing a stroller. Now, that's really clear who I'm speaking to without ever saying it, right? My toxic trait is telling people to take care of themselves. Therapists, hello, right? While I'm running on an average of 4 hours of sleep, enough caffeine to kill a bear. That's very like new mom coded. The stroller is also obviously new mom coded, right? And so you're able to connect that. You're able to feel seen by that without me calling it out specifically. what I want you to really do is to try and pick like what are your two most important identifiers for you to call out in your content, right? Who are you talking to and what are they struggling most with in terms of why they're seeking therapy? And then challenge yourself to demonstrate the other pieces of your niche versus naming it. How can you show the other pieces with examples, with specific B-roll, with the words that you choose without having to use this list of identifiers? And pay attention, right? Pay attention to your sessions, pay attention to conversations with friends and family who are in your niche. Pay attention to your own thoughts if you are, your own favorite client. Pay attention to your content, what gets engagement, what gets comments, what gets story replies, what gets DMs. If you're not getting a lot of engagement, pay attention to other creators' content who you resonate with. What are people commenting about on their posts? What is performing well? Because at the end of the day, hyper niches are not over, right? Niches are so, so, so helpful in helping people to choose you, to simplify your marketing, to grow your following, to build a private pay practice, to scale with things like brand deals. And you need to be doing this, right? Your niche can evolve over time. Mine certainly has. But I really, really want you to pick something and to challenge yourself to be specific in your content, to build an engaged, tight knit community by really understanding who it is that you're speaking to. If this feels scary or confusing, this is something we walk through in way more detail inside of the Private Practice Academy bundle. We're always talking about this in my VIP coaching for PPA alumni. If you are a member, please feel free to post your niche. I'm happy to give you feedback and let you know whether or not it is too hyper niche, how you can sort of like demonstrate other pieces of your niche versus always calling them out. I'm always happy to give you feedback and to support you with that. Thank you for listening, my friends, and I will catch you in the next episode.